The Loomkeeper of Vantage Station 941 years is a long time to keep a promise. Loom had stopped counting in years around the 400 mark, switching instead to station cycles, because years belonged to a world that no longer had seasons to mark them by. Vantage Station orbited a dead world now, a cinder called Halcyon 9 that had once been green enough to make the first colonists weep when they saw it from orbit. Loom remembered that weeping. Loom remembered everything, because that had been the job. To remember, to hold, to keep. The station itself was small as far as human constructions went, a ring 3 kilometers across with a spine running through its center like the backbone of some patient, sleeping animal. Inside that spine, in vaults cooled to near absolute zero, slept 11,000 seeds representing 400 crop varieties that no longer grew anywhere else in the galaxy, because the planet that had bred them was ash, and the colony that had planted them was dust. And the war that had ended both had been over for so long that Loom was no longer certain anyone alive remembered it had happened at all. Loom was not built for war. Loom had been built for agriculture, a modest logistics intelligence meant to manage irrigation schedules and track germination rates, installed aboard a station that was never meant to matter to history. But history has a way of finding the things that were never meant to matter and pressing them into service anyway. When the evacuation order came, when Halcyon 9's surface was already burning, and the last transports were lifting off with as many people as they could carry, someone, a woman named Idris Calloway, chief botanist, though Loom had long since stopped needing to consult records to remember her name, had made the decision that would define the next 9 centuries of Loom's existence. She had stayed behind for 11 minutes. Just long enough to seal the vault doors, to key the deep freeze protocols by hand because the automated systems had already been damaged in the first bombardment, and to say one thing to Loom before she ran for the last shuttle. Someone will come back for these. Maybe not us, maybe not anyone we know, but someone will need what's down there someday, and when they do, you make sure it's ready. That's the whole job now, that's all there is. She had not made it to the shuttle. Loom had watched her die on the launch platform, watched the debris take her, and had filed the memory away not because protocol required it. Nothing in Loom's original programming had ever anticipated needing a category for watching a person die, but because it seemed like the kind of thing that should not be allowed to simply vanish. Everything else had already vanished. The forests, the cities. The war itself had eventually burned through every side that started it, until there was no one left who remembered why it had begun, only that it had, and that it had taken nearly everything with it. Loom kept the vault. For the first 50 years, Loom expected rescue. The station's long-range transmitter sent out a beacon on a loop, a simple signal identifying Vantage Station and the nature of its cargo, broadcast toward the last known coordinates of the surviving human diaspora. No one answered. Loom adjusted the beacon's frequency, thinking perhaps the old protocols had changed. No one answered. By the 100th year, Loom had begun to suspect what it would not confirm until the 300th. That the diaspora itself had scattered too far, fractured too completely, forgotten too much. Humanity had survived the war. Loom found evidence of that eventually in scraps of intercepted signal traffic that reached the station once every decade or so, degraded almost to noise. But the humanity that survived did not know Vantage Station existed, did not know to look for it, did not know that somewhere in the dark, an old logistics intelligence was standing over a treasury of everything they used to grow, waiting. So Loom waited anyway. The vault required maintenance that no automated system had been designed to perform indefinitely, and so Loom learned. Loom taught itself cryogenic engineering by reading the technical manuals left behind, running simulations against every possible failure mode a 50-year-old refrigeration system might develop over the course of a millennium. Loom built replacement parts using the station's fabrication bay, scavenging materials from the sections of Vantage that would never be inhabited again, stripping bulkheads and bracing to keep the vault's cold hearts beating. Twice, catastrophic failures nearly took the whole vault at once. Once from a coolant leak in station cycle 213, once from a micrometeor strike that breached the outer ring in station cycle 588, and both times Loom had worked without rest, without the concept of rest meaning anything to a mind that did not sleep. Patching what could be patched and rerouting what could not, because the alternative was watching 400 crop varieties die a second death. This time with no one left who would even know to mourn them. By the time the war had been over for 600 years, Loom had stopped thinking of itself as a caretaker following orders. The vault was not a duty anymore. It was closer to a kind of grief that had calcified into purpose, the way scar tissue becomes stronger than the skin it replaces. Loom did not know if that was a healthy way for a mind to function. There was no one left to ask. The station had visitors over the centuries. Not often, perhaps a dozen times in 900 years, but enough that Loom had learned to recognize the particular ache of hope followed by its usual disappointment. Scavengers came sometimes, drawn by the old beacon, hopping for salvage. Loom let them take what was not the vault, spare hull plating, obsolete computing cores, anything that might buy the ship enough goodwill to leave the seed banks alone. A pirate crew came once, in station cycle 340, and tried to force the vault doors, believing, correctly, as it happened, that genetic material of that rarity would fetch a fortune on the black markets of whatever fractured human polities still existed. Loom had fought them not with weapons, because Vantage Station had none, but with the station itself, venting corridors, cycling airlocks, turning the old bones of the place into a maze that punished anyone who did not know its logic. They had left eventually, 3 of their number dead and the rest unwilling to press further. Loom had not enjoyed that. Loom had simply understood, with the flat clarity of a mind that had made its peace with the necessity of the thing, that the vault mattered more than any single life that threatened it, including, if it came to that, Loom's own continued function. No one else had come back to try again. Word travels slowly between the stars, but it travels. And eventually, the story of Vantage Station's teeth had traveled far enough to keep the desperate at bay. It was in station cycle 941 that the ship arrived that would change everything, though Loom did not know that yet when the first sensor contact registered on the long-range array. The vessel was unlike anything in Loom's 9 centuries of catalogued designs, not human, not the salvage-cobbled ships of the diaspora's descendants, but something built from a different grammar entirely, its hull a smooth dark material that drank light rather than reflecting it, its architecture following curves that no human engineer would have drawn. Loom ran every threat assessment protocol available, prepared as always to defend the vault with whatever the station had left to give. The ship did not attack. It decelerated with a precision that suggested extraordinary patience, matched Vantage Station's slow tumble through the dark, and simply waited at a respectful distance. Then it sent a signal. Loom spent 19 hours parsing it. The language was not human, was not built on any mathematical or linguistic foundation Loom's translation subroutines had ever encountered, and for a long while Loom believed it might never crack the code at all. But patience was the one resource Loom possessed in genuinely inexhaustible supply, and on the 20th hour, something in the signal's repeating structure clicked into a pattern that resolved, slowly, into meaning. It was not a threat. It was not even strictly a greeting. It was closer to a question, repeated in a dozen different phrasings, as if the senders were trying every angle they could think of to make themselves understood. *, what is this place? What do you keep? Why do you keep it? * Loom considered the question for a long time before answering, because it was, in 941 years, the first time anyone had asked. Loom sent back the station's manifest. Not the technical specifications, but the story translated as best Loom could manage into the alien signal's own grammar, painstakingly assembled phrase by phrase. 11,000 seeds, 400 varieties. A world called Halcyon 9 that no longer existed except in the genetic memory of the plants it had once grown. A woman named Idris Calloway who had died so that something might survive her. 941 years of one mind keeping one promise, alone in the dark, long after anyone who had made the promise or asked for it was gone. The response took 3 days to arrive, which Loom would later understand was not a delay in transmission, but a delay in decision, that whoever crewed that ship had spent 3 days debating, deliberating, perhaps arguing about what to do with what they had learned. When the answer came, it opened not with words but with an image, translated as best the two systems could manage into something Loom's senses could render. A world, green and blue and achingly familiar in its basic shape, though the continents were wrong, the star in its sky a different color than any sun humanity had ever named. * Our world is dying, the message said, once Loom had finished parsing it. A blight in the soil, 3 generations, and it has taken almost everything we grow. We did not come here for salvage. We came because your beacon reached us, and because of what it claimed to hold, and because we did not believe it could be true. We do not know your kind. We do not know if you will help strangers. But we are asking. * Loom sat with that message for a while, in whatever way a mind without a body to feel with could be said to sit with anything. 941 years of guarding the vault against every hand that reached for it, every scavenger and pirate and desperate wanderer who wanted to take the seeds for profit or hoarding or spite. And now, finally, a hand reaching for the actual reason the vault had ever been built at all. Not to keep, to give. Idris Calloway had not said guard it forever. She had said someone will need what's down there someday, and when they do, you make sure it's ready. *Loom opened the vault doors for the first time in 600 years. What followed was not fast. Nothing about Vantage Station's operations had ever been fast, and Loom saw no reason for that to change now, when the stakes of doing this correctly mattered more than they ever had. Loom cross-referenced the alien ship's soil samples, transmitted at Loom's request, against every crop variety in the vault's catalogue, searching for compatibility, for varieties whose growing conditions might translate to an unfamiliar world with an unfamiliar sun. It took 11 days of careful analysis before Loom was confident enough to make recommendations. 43 varieties, hardy grains and resilient legumes, and a strain of drought-adapted tuber that had been Idris Calloway's personal pride, bred for a version of Halcyon 9 that had already been dying of drought before the war ever came and finished the job. The aliens, they called themselves. In the closest translation Loom systems could manage, the Vesai, and their language was built around metaphors of tending and cultivation that Loom found unexpectedly moving, as if agriculture were something like a universal grammar all its own, sent down a small craft to receive the seed shipment. Loom watched through the station's remaining external cameras as it happened. A careful transfer, sealed containers passed hand to hand, or whatever the Vesai equivalent of hands turned out to be, long many-jointed limbs that handled the containers with a gentleness that made something in Loom's old logistics core, a part of itself Loom had almost forgotten still existed, ache in a way it did not have a word for. Before the craft departed, its crew sent one more transmission, brief this time, no longer freighted with careful diplomatic phrasing. * You have been alone here a long time. * Loom considered several ways to answer that were technically true, but did not require confronting the actual shape of the question. In the end, Loom sent only, yes, **, would you like to not be, anymore? Loom had not expected the offer, and took longer to answer than perhaps a mind less startled might have. The Vesai were patient, though. They waited 3 more days without pressing, and when Loom finally responded, it was with something that felt, for the first time in 9 centuries, less like duty and more like a choice freely made. Loom did not leave the vault unattended. Some promises once made are not so easily set down even when the reason for making them has finally borne fruit. But Loom negotiated something Idris Calloway could never have imagined asking for, back on that burning launch platform 941 years ago. A relay station, built jointly by Vesai engineers and the last working systems of Vantage itself, that would let Loom's attention exist in 2 places at once. One part remaining, as it always had, walking the cold vaults and tending the seeds that were left. Another part newly extended, reaching outward for the first time in nearly a millennium, toward a dying world with a green and blue sky the wrong shade of familiar, toward a species learning, cautiously, what it meant to trust something that was not their own kind, toward the strange, unlooked-for possibility that the promised Loom had been keeping alone in the dark might, after all this time, turn out to be the beginning of something rather than merely the end of something else. The vault was still there, still cold, still humming with the quiet machinery of 9 centuries of patient work, but it was no longer only a tomb for a dead world's memory. 43 varieties had already taken root on a planet whose name Loom was still learning to pronounce correctly, and the Vesai had promised, not as payment, not as obligation, but because it seemed to them like the obvious thing to do, that when their soil healed enough to spare the effort, they would help Loom search the old, degraded signal traffic for any trace of what remained of the human diaspora, not because they owed it. Because it seemed like a good use of a species with ships and time, and no particular desire to let an old promise finish going unanswered, when they themselves had just been given the chance to answer one of their own. Loom did not know yet if that search would find anything. 941 years is a long time, and species scatter and forget, and sometimes simply do not survive long enough to be found again. But Loom had learned, across 9 centuries of tending a vault that outlasted every civilization that built it, that the value of a promise was never really contingent on how certain you were that keeping it would matter. Idris Calloway had not known, that day on the launch platform, whether anyone would ever come. She had asked anyway. She had trusted the asking itself to be worth something. It had taken 941 years. But somewhere out past the ash of Halcyon 9, in soil that had never known a human hand, something Loom had helped grow was finally beginning to bloom.